Hey you guys, welcome back to the channel. Today's sew-along is going to be a one shoulder ruffled smock dress. This is perfect for the summer. I made it out of cotton fabric. It was 100% cotton. The things you are going to need is on the list right here. So definitely follow along. If you have any questions, drop them down below. Subscribe, like, and share the channel as this will greatly help me going forward. Here we go. The first thing you are going to do is take pattern 3 and pattern 4 and pin the side seams. Now, the side seam will have 2 notches, so be sure to pin it to the right side and not the shoulder seam, which only has 1 notch in the middle. Once you have it pinned, go ahead and sew it at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. It should look like this. Iron it flat, iron it open, and now you are ready to work on the opposite end. Go ahead and grab your straps, and this time you are going to pin the strap to pattern 3 and 4. Make sure that your straps are almost perpendicular, so place them at an angle so that when you open them, it gives you a continuous line and it's not angled down or upwards. So when you place it at an angle, it allows you to sew it so that your strap and your yoke is one continuous line. So pin it in place. Make sure to add as many pins as needed to secure it, and you're going to sew this at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once sewn, iron it open just like before. Once complete, the next step would be to prepare the bodice. Pin both side seams on the bodice front and the bodice back, and go ahead and sew at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Do ignore the fact that this garment is partially gathered already. I recorded the video during the first time that I was sewing it just so that I wouldn't have to record twice or make 2 garments. But go ahead and pin and sew at a 1/2 inch seam allowance for both side seams on the bodice, and then be sure to treat your raw edge by serging or zigzag stitching. Alright, this is what it should look like, and now you are ready to finish that armhole opening. Using your binding strip, you are going to attach it to that armhole opening. Now it is better that we prep the binding strip prior to attaching it. It makes it super easy to complete if it's prepped. If it's not prepped, then you're totally winging it, and you just gotta make sure that you sew super straight. So in order for you to prep it, go ahead and grab your binding strip, and you are going to fold it in half. Once you fold it in half, go ahead and iron it all the way across. Make sure that your material is keeping its crease. The fabric that I have is cotton, therefore it is very compliant. It's very compliant, and it will do whatever you tell it to do with a hot iron, okay? I try to stay away from polyester, and especially right now, if it's summer, it'll make you sweaty. So cotton for me is the best way to go. Once you iron it in half, go ahead and fold the raw edge, one of the raw edges inward, so that it's touching the previous crease that you've made, and iron that again. You're going to iron it all the way down, and then you repeat the same process for the other side. And that completes the binding. Now you are ready to pin it to your bodice. With the right sides together, pin your binding to your bodice. Make sure that the top of the binding go beyond the top of the bodice, just so that it can fully encase once we sew the other side of the binding. As you pin it across the binding, be sure to not stretch your bodice. Take your time with this step. If you're afraid that you will stretch it, then I would advise, before pinning your binding, add a stay stitch on top of the bodice so that your the perimeter of the bodice doesn't expand, like the armhole opening doesn't expand. And then you just sew straight across. Now, the first ditch line, the one that's closest to the raw edge, line it up with your needle and sew straight across. Go nice and steady and make sure that your seam allowance stays true. Now that you have attached the binding to the armhole opening, we are almost there. What we need to do is trim the seam allowance. So you're going to trim and add some clips all along the curvature of that armhole opening. Be careful as you're clipping so you don't clip beyond the stitch line or clip the body of your fabric. As you are doing your clipping and maneuvering around the binding, if you realize that the seam allowance is way too thick, you can always go back in, use your scissors, and trim alongside the stitch line. Just go ahead and make it a shorter seam allowance. That way when you fold that binding over, it lays nice and flat. The goal with folding the binding over is that you want the back side to roll just a little bit past where the stitch line is. That way as you stitch on the right side, it catches that folded edge and everything is encased within the binding. So remember how earlier I said there are some parts that were going to be complete and some weren't because I created this video during my first run of creating this garment? Well, yeah, this is that part. This is another one of those parts. So you're going to be creating a basting stitch. Now your bodice should pretty much be already attached and practically complete. So when you are creating these basting stitch, be sure to not stitch over your seam allowance. So your first basting stitch is going to be 1/4 of an inch away from the raw edge, and then the secondary basting stitch will be 1/4 of an inch away from the previous. Make sure that your thread is hanging long and that you're not back stitching at the beginning or at the end. The reason that we put these basting stitches there without the back stitching is because we need to be able to pull those threads in order to gather the fabric. First thing you're going to do is separate your needle thread from your bobbin thread. Once it's separated, go ahead and add some knots. These knots are simply going to be on your separated threads. So bobbin thread will be knotted together and needle thread will be knotted together. Repeat this step for all of the ending strings that are hanging from your gathering stitches. Once that's done, I would go ahead and pin the side seam of the yoke to the upper side seam of your bodice. Make sure you're pinning it so that, you know, center back is with center back and center front is with center front. So it's imperative that you have your notches in place. Once those two steps are complete, you are ready to start gathering. So holding tight onto one set of your stitches, whether it is the needle thread or the bobbin thread, slowly start to move your fabric away from where it originally stood on those threads. As you slightly start to tug on it, it will shift down and create small gathers. If you realize that your fabric is beginning to get stuck, you can gently move it backwards from the back end. If that doesn't work, then go on the opposite end of your gathering row and begin to make small gathers from the opposite end. From this point, I would go ahead and pin the center front together and your center back together. That way you have a better estimate on how much more gathering is needed. Make sure that your gathers are even, because it will show if it's not. Since this is the upper bodice, you always got to make sure that part is on point, okay? And just be gentle, use as many pins as needed. Be careful so that you don't break your stitch line, because if you do, you'll have to start this process over, because it's not easy for you to continue making a gathers on a broken gathering line. Once it is fully pinned, it should look a little something like this. Make sure to match your notches as you go, and you will stop right before you get to your actual strap. So you're going to create your first stitch, adjust your sewing machine so that you're back at your regular setting, and the seam allowance for the top of the bodice neckline, attaching it to the yoke, will be a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I like to keep my gathers at the top because I can easily maneuver them. That way nothing is folding over and everything's laying nice and flat. Now the key for this is to adjust your gathers as you go. Make sure you keep a true seam allowance at a 1/2 inch and just go as steady as possible. If you feel like it is necessary or easier for you to keep your gathers at the bottom, then by all means do so. Move your threads as you sew so that it's not being caught in between the right side of the fabric. Allow it to hang off of the raw edge, so in the end, whenever it's time for you to trim or clean off that fabric, you can easily trim off the threads. It's not so fun cleaning the threads off of the right side. But just, keep an eye out so that everything is going into the right direction. Nothing's folding over, nothing's creasing, nothing is creating any tiny pleats. And everything is fitting nice and even. Be sure to keep your gathers within your notches, and be sure to end your bodice at the notch where it's supposed to match onto your yoke. Now that we've attached the bodice to one of the center front and center back yokes, we will attach the secondary onto that. So go ahead and grab it. It should already be attached to the strap, and just lay it on top, matching your side seam, your center front seam, center back seam, and shoulder seam. Once you have those matched, add your pins. Your pins should be all around the perimeter of the yoke as well as the strap. Now, once you reach the bottom end, you will go over the bodice just a little bit. You're not going to be able to go all the way through because the material will be too thick. So be sure to pay attention to where you're stitching so that you don't fold over and create a bad stitch where you're catching the body of the bodice where it's not supposed to be catching anything. So use as many pins as needed to keep it secure. Now that it's all pinned and secure, line up your sewing machine so that you can get ready to sew. The seam allowance here will be a 1/2 inch. Make sure to back stitch at the beginning of your stitch so that it doesn't unravel. Since we're going to have to turn this inside out, it will add a lot of tension towards the opening. Be steady as you go and sew all around the perimeter of the strap. When you get to the end of the strap, make sure you sink your needle as you pivot and turn. As you get closer towards the end, make sure that your bodice is not pinching over towards the seam allowance. Take your time with this step and gently just move it out of the way and go as far into the bodice yoke as you possibly can. I ran out of thread right here towards the end. I probably could have pushed it in a little bit more further so that I sew majority of that the yoke towards the bodice, but I ran out of thread, so that was I called it a day. Now that you are done with the yoke, and the strap, we are going to clip. Clipping allows it to lay nice and flat, so just like we did with the binding, we will do the same thing to the strap and the yoke. So go ahead and trim around the areas where there's seam allowance. That's at the shoulder and that's also at the side seam. Make sure you add your clippings all around the areas that have curves, and at the end of the strap you can go ahead and make a diagonal cut. That way when you turn it inside out, it lays nice and flat. Be sure to not cut your thread, or your seam line I should say, otherwise you're gonna have a hole and you'll have to re-sew that area so that it doesn't, it doesn't unravel. To make it easier to turn it inside out, use your loop turner, your sewing loop turner, so that it's an easier process. Once you're done, it should look a little something like this. I went ahead and I used a pencil to push those little corners out. Aside from that, just grab your iron and iron the straps as flat as possible. As you get closer towards the center of your bodice, roll your seam allowance inwards so that it is tucked into the yoke. Use as many pins as needed in order to stabilize that fold and that crease that you're creating. Keep an eye on the upper edge. Sometimes it is easier if you open up the yoke and you iron that seam allowance upwards. That way it lays nice and flat. And the yoke that is in the inside is not rolling outwards, right? You want it to lay nice and flat and neat. Once you have it all pinned, now you are ready to top stitch your yoke. We are going to top stitch from the outside. So just like with the binding, you have to make sure that your fold is almost slightly surpassing your previous stitch of your yoke. The seam allowance for this step should be about 1/4 of an inch. Just try to stay as close to the edge as possible. Now I'm literally using the width of the side of the presser foot, which I believe is about 1/4 of an inch, if not 1/8 of an inch. Technically this would be considered an edge stitch because it's less than 1/4 of an inch. But as long as you keep that seam allowance steady and all the way around the perimeter of the yoke as well as the strap, then you are good to go. As you are sewing, keep an eye on the bottom edge of the yoke because that's the part that's unseen. Just make sure that you catch it, that way it's not opening, when you're wearing the garment. Now that the bodice is complete, we are going to attach it to your first tier. In order to attach it, we have to create the gathers and sew up the side seams. So line up your side seam for your first tier and pin it to secure it in place. The seam allowance for this will be 1/2 inch. Be sure to serge it before continuing on to your gathering stitches. Since this is the same process we will repeat for tier 2, I would go ahead and pin the vertical seams for tier 2 and serge them all at once. Now that all of the vertical seams are complete, we are ready for the gathering stitches. Go ahead and add the gathering stitches, your basting stitch at the top of tier 1 and also at the top of tier 2. Don't forget to leave your threads nice and long at the end so that we can tie them just like we did with the upper bodice. Be sure to have your center front and center back marked. I went ahead and I made small notches so that I can see where my center front is in the midst of my gathers. because sometimes if you just mark it with a pen, it's hard for you to see it. So when I make that V cut into it, like so, I'm able to find it a little bit more quicker than if I were to just mark it with like a pen or something like that. Once you have it marked and you have your gathers gathered, go ahead and start pinning. We're gonna pin first the quadrants. So your side seam will be pinned together first, and then we'll do the center front and center back seam. Once you have those, then you can continue to shift your gathers so that you make it fit into the area that it is supposed to fit into. Use as many pins as needed. Make sure that your thread is hanging on the wrong side of the fabric, so that once you're done sewing, you don't have too much trimming that's needed to be done on the right side. Now, the next thing to do would be to serge that tier horizontally all the way around, but since we have to attach the secondary tier, I would just leave it for now and just begin to do the gathers for tier 2. Because tier 2 has 3 pieces, we are going to use one of the seams to fold the entire tier in half. Once we fold it in half, we'll mark it so that that particular mark becomes our center back. From there, we'll fold it in half again so that we can have our side seams. Once these markings are in place, go ahead and make sure, just double check that the center front and the center back at the bottom of tier 1 is still visible, because from this point you will begin to do your gathers for the top of tier 2 and attach it to the bottom of tier 1. Now that all tiers are complete, you can go ahead and serge horizontal seams. Go ahead and serge it all the way around. We are practically done with the garment. The only thing that's left is to do the hemming. Now, in order to hem, I like to iron first because I think it makes it a whole lot easier than pinning and having like a ton of pins for you to pull out as you sew. So what I like to do is use my seam gauge to measure how much I'm folding it over, which here it's 1/4 of an inch. And then once I iron it all the way around, then I go back and I fold it again onto itself so that it's another 1/4 of an inch on top of that. And then I iron again. After you're done ironing, then you do a beautiful top stitch on top of that. Be sure to start on your side seam and make sure to trim in the areas that you feel that it may be bulky, like your side seam, your the center back seam. Be sure to trim. And that is it, folks. We did it. Oh, this dress came out absolutely stunning. I love it. This is what it looks like. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, drop them down below. Subscribe, like, share, as this will greatly help my channel. And I will see you next time.